Now, tonight we're going to be talking about the art of asking. I was drawn to this topic after reading an extraordinary memoir by a musician and performance artist named Amanda Palmer, whom some of you may already know. Amanda Palmer began her career as a street performer and is a sort of philosopher-poet of vulnerability. In fact, Brené Brown wrote the foreword to her book. In Palmer's first gig as a street artist, she used to stand on a milk crate in a wedding dress in Harvard Square. She created a character called the 8-Foot Bride. And after that, she became an indie rock musician with a radical approach to funding her own work, her own creative work, through asking her loyal fan base to help her. In fact, she created the most successful crowdfunding event in history. She raised well over $1 million. Palmer learned on the job through hard knocks and in sudden moments of human connection as a street artist that, as she puts it, quote, almost every important human encounter boils down to the act and art of asking. Why is that such a radical idea? That's what drew me to this topic. Why did 8 million people tune into her TED Talk on this subject, for example? Well, in a culture that thrives on competition, bottom lines, on professional pride, asking others for help, simply holding out our hand, is often looked down upon. We're made to feel like asking is begging, and that it's a sign of weakness and failure. What Amanda Palmer learned standing on her milk crate, and later by leaving her record label and asking her fans to fund her music, is that in fact there's nothing more tender or enlightening than being humble enough to ask for help and giving others the chance to be generous to us. Every time someone dropped a coin or a bill in the box on the ground in front of the 8-Foot Bride, Palmer, in her white face, would break her statue stillness and hand the person a flower. She said, gifting them my flower, my holy little token, was what made me feel like an artist, someone with something to offer instead of a charity case. When generosity is met with gratitude, asking becomes a sacred act of mutual recognition. Palmer puts this very clearly. She says, asking for help with shame says, you have power over me. Asking with conscience says, I have power over you. But asking for help with gratitude says, we have the power to help each other. Inured to the notion of one up, one down in our culture, of inequity and disconnection, we're taught to struggle, climb, acquire, succeed, precisely in order not to have to ask for help, not to be dependent, never to be forced to admit that we are not islands unto ourselves. But no one is a self-made person. The most independent life has depended on the kindness of strangers, on luck and timing and 1,000 factors that are beyond our control. Imagining ourselves immune to need and fantasizing a world where no one is vulnerable is a heartless, unnatural vision of life. As Palmer writes, it's not so much the act of asking that paralyzes us. It's what lies beneath: the fear of being vulnerable, the fear of rejection, the fear of looking needy or weak, the fear of being seen as a burdensome member of the community instead of as a productive one. It points, as she says, fundamentally to our separation from one another. But when we separate ourselves, when we see ourselves as separate from others, asking feels like defeat. But when we remember that there is no us without them, asking becomes a recognition of indissoluble connection, benefit, and the law of reciprocity. This is very interesting. Reciprocity is a phenomenon whose depth and primacy many of us don't fully grasp. In fact, reciprocity, asking and giving, is hardwired into the brain as part of the moral organ we inherit from millions of years of evolution. This moral organ, which I wrote about in Ethical Wisdom, has 5 primary tunes, so to speak, one of which centers on justice and fairness. In order to survive as a species, especially to be able to get along outside our kin groups and to socialize with strangers, We developed a system of exchange that not only ensures fairness and enables us to care for one another, but also strengthens empathy and allows us to transcend differences in order to experience our essential connection. We do this via an exchange organ in the brain that keeps track of fairness. It's not a literal organ, but different neurons and tissues working together to do a single job. Determinations of right and wrong are based on tallies made by this exchange organ of favors received and given, generosity compensated or not, status attained or refused, the arithmetic of perceived personal justice. Whether you're a hunter-gatherer living on the savannah or an executive on Wall Street, your brain is running particular software for social contracts and precautions, and the punishment of cheaters and users. The philosophical manifestation of this biological law is, of course, the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's not accidental that the golden rule is the only philosophical concept that is common to all spiritual traditions. It's the only one. Reciprocity is in our blood. It's the consistent, unifying principle that makes social life possible. We reciprocate, in fact, even when it's not necessary. There was a famous study done involving Christmas cards that were sent by strangers, and they found that an unexpectedly high percentage of recipients returned the favor just to be nice. Seen in this light, we understand why Palmer needed to give a flower in exchange for donations in order not to feel like a user. When we realize that reciprocity is a human norm hardwired into our brains many hundreds of thousands of years ago, it broadens our perspective on the art of asking. Rather than being a deviation, we understand that asking and the humility that goes with it are the norm. When we understand that what goes around comes around, and that the natural state is neither to hoard, amass, and be selfish, or to mooch, sponge, and have our hand out all the time. Instead, the norm is exchange. Our gifts are meant to be shared and circulated. There's freedom in being able to ask, as there is liberation in being able to give. If you haven't read Lewis Hyde's classic book, The Gift, Creativity and the Artist in the Modern World, I highly, highly recommend it on this subject. It's beautiful. Now, asking is also a profound spiritual practice. It's why monks in India beg for their meals, not only because their faith traditions prohibit them from having possessions, but also because it opens the heart, it silences pride, and it allows other people in. They symbolize spiritual poverty, which is a state of receptivity, openness, and humility. One of the most powerful spiritual experiences I've ever had happened in an Indian town called Mahabalipuram many, many years ago. There was an extremely crippled homeless man who sat in a particular spot every day. And when you walked past him, he would just beam at you. He would just radiate love through these wild eyes. His legs were withered to the size of a thick rope. He was severely crippled. He got around by dragging his legs behind him in the street like a crab. And yet, when he sat there with his face full of joy, the contrast between his horrible physical condition and the joy emanating from him fused for me into some kind of an epiphany about asking and giving. He didn't shake his cup at you and scowl if you gave him no money. He wasn't demanding. He was offering the chance to help him. And many passers-by did. A lot of people drawn to his sort of natural radiance. And the paradox, this enigma of seeing someone so poor and yet so free. This crippled man seemed to be saying, this too is possible. In such an exchange, it's hard to know who is the helper and who is the helped. There's no martyrdom or self-pity. There's no anger toward other people's fortune. Asking in that way doesn't say, look at me. It says, look at yourself. You feel when you look at me. When I reflect your impermanence back to you, do you recoil from fear and aversion? Do you block out the pain you feel in your heart when you witness my lot in life? That's the contribution of so-called unfortunates to our spiritual evolution. They make us feel pity as well as compassion. They pain us. They remind us of our fragility. That's why we have contempt for the homeless and hide our aged in homes out of sight in the United States, in this triumphalist culture, because they make us feel too much. They make us remember that someday it will be us who will be asking, who will be crippled in some way or other, and who will be torn between the urge to give up and the urge to be grateful, accept, and smile, to say, even this is possible. Now, the enemy of gratitude is pride. A proud person, by which I mean someone who flatters himself into thinking that he got there alone and he doesn't need anybody else, that kind of person cannot be grateful. It's too threatening to the proud person's sense of self, which depends on the illusion of disconnection in order to feel strong and real. I don't know if you've ever known someone like that, who is just too proud to be truly grateful. I used to have a friend like that. The two words that she couldn't quite grasp in her vocabulary were thank and you. They just wouldn't cross her lips. It was such a peculiar thing in a person who had many other good qualities. As an only child of rich but unloving parents, she developed a personality that was both entitled and desperate, both arrogant and deeply insecure. When she asked for things, it was always in the form of a demand. She couldn't muster the courage to appear vulnerable. And when you did something for her, it was met with a kind of a grunt of recognition. It used to bother me a lot and make me not want to help her. At the time, I thought it was just that I was selfish and mean, which I was. But today I realize it was more than that. It was the moral exchange organ in my brain, this ancient reciprocating mechanism that was crying foul. It just wasn't fair not to get a thank you. Her entrapment in pride prevented her from seeing that. She couldn't see that it was wrong. Her empathy channels were very severely blocked. She didn't have access to emotional intelligence. And she was always being surprised by friends who broke off relations. Like many narcissistic people, she was always the victim. Pride and a sense of victimization make the art of asking as a shared experience impossible. Not accidentally, this same woman's creative work was chronically blocked as well. Because creativity is a giving act. It's a desire to share. And it depends on knowing how to ask others to help you get your work into the world. As Amanda Palmer puts it, there's a certain sense of indiscriminate gratitude that is essential to hone if you're going to survive in the arts. Isn't that beautiful? There's a certain sense of indiscriminate gratitude that is essential to hone if you're going to survive in the arts. That's the truth. If you can't get past your pride to ask and are forced to demand, you can't receive with grace. And there is nothing more humbling than being an artist. That's how pride blocks creativity. Of course, pride is often a mask for the fear of rejection. How much of your life is dictated and limited by the terror of being pushed away? Ask yourself that question. It's easy to imagine the world as sort of one big no waiting to happen and protect ourselves accordingly by becoming cynical or too proud, evasive in relationships, bitter, frightened, aloof, or half-baked. Half-baked in the sense of being half-realized, half-alive, half-unfurled as human beings, constricted by the fear of rejection. This is such an important point to grasp. So ask yourself, where do you stop yourself for fear of being shut out, abandoned, ridiculed, disappointed? How does this primitive response, which is linked to fight or flight, trying to survive in an antagonistic world, how does it hold you back and intimidate you? How can you reframe rejection itself, not as a failure or a reflection of your worth, but as a chance to get over yourself? I'm not saying that rejection doesn't hurt, and some forms of rejection are downright cruel. But the passing rejections of asking for something and being turned down, or wanting something that someone isn't able or willing to give, are what a teacher of mine used to call 5-pound weights in terms of spiritual evolution. A 5-pound weight is an opportunity to rewire our patterning by learning a new response to non-life-threatening stimuli. In other words, something minor happens, and it triggers you in a particular way that keeps you stuck. Learning to pick up that 5-pound weight to get over that small thing enables you to strengthen the muscle of reconditioning, so that when big things come up, you're able to keep your balance and your clarity. It's always striking to me that the more full of themselves people are, the more attached to their reputation and in need of being noticed and proud and self-aggrandizing, in other words, the more insecure, the more agonizingly these same people feel rejection. Back to my friend, whom I still love a lot, she would agonize for months over small slights, sort of woe is meing and how could they, I just can't believe it. Instead of being humble and saying simply, I asked and they said no. Next. I asked, they said no, next. Instead she would obsess over the turn down in this sort of how dare they way and made it all about her ad nauseum. That's because for narcissists, rejection of any kind registers as obliteration. Just look at what just happened with Kim Jong-un and being slighted by that satirical movie. Okay? Narcissists register rejection and criticism as obliteration. But that's another conversation. The point is that the art of asking depends on reframing rejection as a 5-pound spiritual exercise in getting over ourselves, lightening up, having a sense of humor, and learning to find the doors that open instead of hitting our heads against ones that don't. Now, the mindset that can't take so-called rejection, that's bound up with desperation, expectation, and entitlement, mistakes humility for humiliation. It's similar to how we mistake surrender for resignation, when in fact they're very different. Humility comes from a sense of wholeness. Humiliation from a sense of being insufficient. Humility is free, light, and other-directed. Humiliation is costly, heavy, and self-absorbed. Humility says, I love myself enough to set myself free. I value myself enough to ask for help. Humiliation says, nobody loves me, nobody wants to set me free, and I don't trust them enough to ask. Do you hear the difference? Humility, like surrender, is a sign of authentic strength. Humiliation is wedded to an image of itself as terminally weak and discarded. In my career as a journalist, I've spent a lot of time with famous people, and I've noticed almost unanimously that the most brilliant, gifted individuals are nearly always the humblest and the least difficult to deal with, while the wannabes, the bee-stringers, are the most demanding, prickly, and puffed up. Once again, in a culture that mistakes strength for machismo and vulnerability for weakness, we're given a distorted image of what power looks like. And through that lens, humility does look like humiliation. But the two feelings are like night and day. Just as strength and humility go hand in hand, and the ability to ask in an open, grateful manner depends on believing in one's own goodness, so is generosity connected to self-worth. In order to give with an open heart, we must feel that we have enough to give, not materially, not just materially, but spiritually. How much we give matters far less than the spirit with which the giving happens. When we give with condescension or grudgingness or expectation or judgment, the gift itself is compromised. Though Palmer, standing on her milk crate, loved getting the occasional $20 bill, it was never the amount that impressed itself on her, but the sincerity and presence of the giver that moved her. In order for there to be a sacred exchange, she had to make eye contact with the giver and return the gift with one of her flowers. When you handed a coin to that beggar in India, he returned the gift with a blessing, a namaste, smiling, holding his palms together to say, I recognize the divine in you. We are connected. We are one. Then the opportunity to give becomes an invitation. It becomes a meeting place. When this happens, it becomes impossible to discern who is the helper and who is the helped. This is a profound lesson on the spiritual path. Until we learn to give and receive both, we cannot recognize the self. When we're attached to the role of being the helper, the rescuer, the giver of blessings, we can easily slip into separation and feelings of invulnerability. I used to be like that myself. I was more than happy to help people in distress. It made me feel good to do it. But when the tables were turned, I would panic. No longer protected by the illusion of control, in need of assistance myself, I would shut down and isolate and shrink and feel bitter. Lacking humility, I suffered humiliation. Lacking faith and self-belief, I lived in terror of being rejected when I couldn't help myself. I realized that my generosity toward others also masked a fear of asking. Without being aware of it, I used to protect my ego by being magnanimous. If I could just stay in the position of giving, that made me a have instead of a have-not. I could feel better about myself by hanging out with less fortunate people. It wasn't until my life fell apart and my health went downhill and I thought I was dying that I began to see life from the other side and to recognize how defended I was, how much I loathed being needy, how little I trusted other people, and how little confidence I had when I could not be the caretaker. It made me feel like a child, which was the one thing I never wanted to be again. Being in the position of asking brought all those feelings back, and there was nowhere to run because I was ill and poor and sometimes homeless. I had to learn to ask without fear. When I worked with Ram Dass a few years later, he went through an even more difficult time, having survived a massive stroke. He couldn't care for himself at all. This spiritual hero who had spent 60 years as a teacher and a caretaker could no longer talk without enormous difficulty, feed himself, or use the bathroom. He was forced to accept the kindness of those who loved him, and he absolutely hated it. His ego couldn't stand the loss of control. And at 67, this man whose life had been dedicated to spiritual awakening realized how far he had to go. This self-reckoning brought down walls in him that he had never before dared to acknowledge. What he said to me when we worked together is that is when I realized that I had a lot more work to do before the end. I wasn't cooked yet, he said. And the uncooked parts centered on body and pride. Ram Dass told me I had ignored my body as much as possible. I'd tried to spiritualize it away, calling it detachment when actually it was fear. And he found that this was more humbling than any service he'd ever performed in so-called spiritual life, allowing people to take care of him. He learned that, quote, when there's genuine surrender between people, the boundaries between power and powerlessness, healer and helped, begin to dissolve. It is the dissolving of boundaries between us and the mystery that loosens the hold of the ego, that allows the soul to be revealed. That's what the art of asking is about. It's about dissolving the boundaries between us and the mystery that loosens the hold of the ego, that allows the soul to be revealed. When we learn to ask for what we need, we practice generosity toward ourselves and others by giving them, as I said, the chance to do good, to connect with us, to witness our vulnerability, and to come into contact with their own. When that happens, both parties are uplifted in the exchange, and love becomes possible. So ask yourself, what do you need to learn about asking? Where are you ungenerous toward yourself? Are you a stoic? Are you a martyr? Would you rather do without than risk being rejected? What is your greatest fear in the realm of asking? What do you need to ask for right now that scares you and leaves you feeling stuck? Do you measure yourself by what you have? When you feel exposed, do you run away? The list of great questions goes on. And you'll discover that, at least I have discovered, and I hope that you discover, that when you look into your relationship to asking, it opens doors of self-awareness that you may not have even known were closed.